Thank you, President Colin, and good evening, board members and Dr. Glass. It's that time of year where we do the enrollment projections for the district. And just to give a little history, we've been providing the enrollment projections really since 2009-2010 school year. Let me pull this up. So real quickly, so Plante and Cressa, we are recognized by the Department of Treasury to provide enrollment projections for school districts. Right now we have about 65 districts around the state. From a mapping standpoint on your screen, so we do everything from southeast Michigan to the west side of the state, and actually even into Illinois, Ohio, and a little bit of Indiana going forward. What I want to do is actually just start with a little bit of demographics of what's happening both nationally, what's happening regionally, what's happening locally here. I don't expect you to read these verbatim, but if you take a look, so Pew Research has been tracking birth rates since 1920. Last year was the lowest birth year on record. So to put it in perspective, anyone that was born in 1956, congratulations, you were the highest birth amount in the state of Michigan. This past year, so you're the height of the baby boomers, Trustee Barron. This past year, the birth rate's been about half of what that number was. We also look at SEMCOG, which is the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. Unfortunately for Michigan, that K-12 enrollment is still going to continue to decline for almost 10% over the next 10 or 15 years. And so some of those things we want to talk about is like, what about the housing stock? What's happening in Southeast Michigan? What's happening with housing prices, availability of housing? And then ultimately get into the specifics of what it means for Bloomfield as you start planning for next year. And again, enrollment's a huge component of that because obviously that's how your foundation dollars are allocated through the state and going forward. So some of the information we're going to take a look at, everyone should recognize the polygon. That is the district's boundaries. So the numbers that you'll be looking at are contained within that polygon. So there's overlaps with some West Bloomfield, Bloomfield Hills, Bloomfield Township, et cetera. But we're looking at what's happening from a geographical information system. We subscribe to Nielsen Claritas. So if you've heard of Nielsen ratings, you go to Kroger, stick in your card, next day you get coupons. Well, our corporate clients love that information. So we actually find that we can tailor some of these reports to what's happening in the polygon for Bloomfield schools. We want to compare you to Oakland County as a whole, and then ultimately to the state of Michigan. I do want to point out, for the last several years, we've used method 1, which is a 6-year average. Going forward, we may want to recommend a method 2, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of some of the changes we saw from, let's say, the last 5 or 6 years to this past year. And then ultimately, how does that calculate out going forward? So as I mentioned, this is just a snapshot from 1990. So any student that was born in 2000, so my son is a senior here in Bloomfield, he's at prom right now, and he was born in 2000. Unfortunately, this past year's birth rate is 3,000 students less. So the good news is it's actually leveled off. So when we were here in 2009, 10, 11, I think some of the board trustees goes, well, where's the bottom of this decline? We think we're there. So even though the economy's back, market's hot, you take a look at the birth rate is actually level and actually is going down slightly. So you have 16,000 students that are seniors or freshmen in college this year that are going. There's about 13,000 that are coming in. So as a county, if you take that 3,000 delta over a 10 or 15 year, that's a 30 to 40,000 student less. So the question is, can you move that many students into houses or transition houses going forward? We'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation, but this is a good snapshot of again, the birth rate and some of those impacts that we're seeing from the district's standpoint. So as I mentioned from the demographic report, the good news is you've captured 76.87% of those eligible K-12 students. So if you recall, some of the questions are, well, how many students are going to the private schools and how many are choosing Bloomfield schools? That number's been pretty consistent over the last 3 or 4 years, which is great. And actually, I'll show you some other slides. It's actually, people are choosing Bloomfield at different times. But you take a look at the 7308, that's the total eligible of PK-12. Last year, that number was 7502. But if you take a look above that red arrow and all that stuff, we're also taking a look at the number of families that's in that black polygon. We're taking a look at how many of those households, so the average median household is 60.6 years old. So again, not a lot of young kids coming with potentially 60-year-olds. But as those individuals move out and potentially younger families move in, again, can that help offset some of that decline? You take a look at the number of houses. So again, the number of K-12 per housing unit is 0.33. So if you say, hey, we build 100 homes, how many students would we anticipate coming out of those 100 homes? It's roughly 33 students. of which 76% would then come to Bloomfield. So it's a numbers game. Again, we just want to point this out from a capture standpoint. You've been very steady. So people are choosing Bloomfield Hills versus the private school option. That's been 23% over the last 3 or 4 years. State average is about 10.6%, and then the county average is about 13.6% for that private versus public. You take a look at the total number of school-aged children on the far right. It's 1.8 million. That includes private, public, et cetera. That number was 2.2 million in 2004. Just to give you a perspective of that 400,000 student loss over the last 10 years. So we start taking a look at the cohorts. Again, your feeders of 0 to 5, 6 to 11, 12 to 17, 18 to 24-year-olds. On the far right, you'll see that number when we first started presenting in 2010, that negative 1.5 was actually negative 12.4. And so again, that number's really started to decrease, and that's that slowing down of the declined birth rate, if you will. When you take a look at it more graphically, if you were a district that was very steady, very consistent, these lines would be as tight as possible. And the 0 to 5, that's your next 5 years of feeders. You can see there the blue diamonds, roughly 1,847 in 2010. Currently, there's 1,731. Again, that number is going to be pretty steady for the next 5 years. The question you have is, if you look at that 12 to 17-year-old, those are the students that are going to be graduating in the next 5 years, and can we close that delta? We'll talk about that here in a bit. So how does Plante, Moran, Cressa do enrollment projections? So again, we take a look at the community demographics. We take a look, so I want to just say special thanks to Ms. Kostick and Ms. Nuki, who's your student services supervisor. She's been a great addition to the districts, helped us really take a look at the last 7 or 8 years of information, making sure we're looking at FTE or head count correctly. So then we take a look at the live birth, and then we make some adjustments based on what we see for housing, what we see for private versus public. And then ultimately we come to the Pupil Enrollment Report, which we're here tonight to talk about. So the study itself, I will not ask you to read this eye chart. You're welcome. But what this is this actually is a report that is audited by the state of Michigan. So this is your DS 4061 report numbers. This is district-wide, and this is all pupils. So if I'm a staff member, I don't live in the district, my student comes to Bloomfield Hills, those students are counted within these numbers here. Again, it goes from K all the way through K-12, and then we're also capturing special education. So again, this is FT, more for financing projections versus a head count, which would be a utilization or a capacity type issue, which we've done in the past. So again, these numbers are not made up, they're audited, and then we take this information and put them into another eye chart. So the thick black line that you see in the middle, everything to the left of that is all that historical data. And so I want to kind of start in the upper left corner, if I may. You'll see 2007, that was the birth year. There was 14,089 students that particular year. If you drop down to the K grade, in 2012-13 school year, there was 331 kindergartners that came to Bloomfield Hills schools. That represents a 2.35% capture of those eligible students. So the good news is that number has consistently gone up as high as 2.67, 2.62 in the last 2 years. Unfortunately, this year it's down to 2.44. So again, we can't tell why people didn't choose at the K level coming in, but we just noticed that was something that was a change from the last 3 or 4 years. So again, you've got 2 issues. You got the 14,000 live births, we're now down to 13,445. But still, you're at that 2.4, 2.5%. The way the chart works is actually diagonally, so we circled 2017-18. So that 349 that you see in that circle, the next year you drop down 1 row and 1 over 1 column, and you have 359 students. So you picked up roughly 3.01%, if you see that percentage underneath those numbers. So the thing that we saw this past year, if you go down to the second grade, you had a 4% growth. And then if you go down to the third grade, for the first time in 5 years, it's actually below 100%, which means you had a loss of roughly 1.3%. That's that, if you look between 3rd and 7th, 3rd and 8th grade, it's a lot lower than it was the last 4 or 5 years. So we started doing some digging. And so the district's been very fortunate really since 2010, 11, 12. The housing values were a lot less. People could afford to move into Bloomfield schools with that cohort or that grade levels. Unfortunately, talking to some local realtors and even just our own MLS, and again, looking at the Zillow, which is, of course, and Trulia, you have 2 factors. So one is the housing price has gone up significantly in the last 2 years, plus the housing stock is significantly down. And so that's the challenge I think the district's going to face is Again, we've got a declining population. The good news is it's actually leveled off. So we think you're going to be around about 330 incoming kindergarten students for the next 5 years. You're graduating 490, you're graduating 470. You are picking students up at 9th grade. So again, you've got a phenomenal asset in the high school. I think you're seeing that 2 to 3% growth from 8th grade to 9th grade, which is great. It's going to be that middle school and that upper elementary of how to capture those students going forward. So one of the things we've done is taken this eye chart, put it more graphical format. So again, K5 is the blue diamonds, and we know that some of your schools are K3, K4, and I just put a K5 standpoint. 6-8, which is the blue squares, and then the high school 9-12s. So again, the high school is designed, again, this is FTE, so this is not the actual number of students, but you'll be right around that 1,700 number, kind of really through 2028. So the school's designed appropriately to house that student body going forward. So kind of the last slide is kind of the side-by-side comparison. So again, the population is actually increasing in that polygon. What's interesting is SEMCOG had a stat that by 2026 there'll be more 65 and olders in Oakland County than K-12 students, just put in perspective. SEMCOG again is the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. They're tied into Wayne State and Michigan State and all those other demographies. The number of households is actually going up. So remember, a household is birth through 24. So yes, my son will be staying at home and commuting to college. And so that's why you're seeing the number of households actually maintaining. As I mentioned, the median age of the families in the high 50s. Then we just did a 2018 projection, kind of private to public, which is a recap. And again, that the two bullets that really talk about the capture rates, 2.44 versus the 2.6, and then just that first time that decrease. So I know some of you board members were on the board in 2010, 11, 12. So we actually went back and we said, what would be the 5-year projection? Because I know we were off from last year to this year's projection. We actually thought you were going to be a little bit higher than what you ultimately ended up being. And so in 2012, 13, in 2018, 19, we thought you'd be at 51, 35 in total number of students. So actually you beat our projection by 141 students. But again, what we're looking at is because of that housing shortage and the increased housing prices, you're going to be in that 5,100 range kind of going forward. So we're actually proposing a method 2 cohort. That's what we showed up on the screen. And again, we've got 3 different methods. Again, we've been using method 1 consistently for the last 5 or 6 years. We think method 2 would be more appropriate, which is a 2-year snapshot to help project out that next 5 years. Because something, again, has changed significantly from where you're at previously. So with that, I will turn it back over to President Cole and the board for any questions.
Anyone have questions?
I know it's a lot of data.
So,
But I can go back to the slide?
Build more houses, will that boost our enrollment?
Yeah, so,
Right.
yeah, so, and that's a great question. I mean, so to give you an example, I think if you look at the Wabeek property, and there's a bunch of homes going up. They've started building the model at Hickory Grove. So let's say you build all 65 of those models. The issue you get into, those starting models are the high 800, 900, up to $1 million plus. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of those young 0 to 5s, but what you may see is people moving from their existing home into those homes, which would free up. But the problem is you're only going to be backfilling 60, 70, 80 homes. So again, when you take a look at the total number of housing units, to offset that delta of 100, you'd have to build about 350 homes a year, every year for the next 5 years. So it's going to be tough. I mean, yes, yes.
15,000 households, so therefore how many build, what percentage of that is?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge to build as many houses. I mean, what's interesting, out of the 112 districts that are in SEMCOG, they're only projecting 2 that'll actually grow. One being South Lyon and the other one being Brighton. But they have hundreds of acres of empty land that they're building thousands of homes, and even with Melissa Baker and South Lyon, they've only picked up X amount of students.
And Cynthia and I sit with the South Line people all the time at Oakland schools, and they're building elementary schools like crazy.
So, and I know you probably just mentioned, so what were the 2 main factors why we were off in terms of our projection that you assumed that?
Absolutely. So one is the housing stock. So the availability of people to move into Bloomfield is significantly less than it was even last year.
That what you thought?
Correct. I mean, interest rates are still really low comparatively to where they were in 2007, 8, 9, 10. And the other factor is the housing price itself. So when you start getting over that $250,000, $300,000 price range, you're kind of pricing out those younger families that would bring that maybe this is their second home, so they're moving from.
So did you not think that it was, like, in your projection, that it wasn't gonna go up, appreciate as much as it did? Is that?
Yeah, what we thought, I mean, what's interesting, we still showed you overall going down. We just didn't think, if you go back to this slide right here, when we looked at method one, we weren't expecting a 98% decrease. We were looking at a 101% capture over the last year. So fortunately for your district, if you 1 or 2% can be 100 kids, and I mean, that's a lot of foundation dollars when you start talking 100 student difference. So again, we were looking at the last 5 or 6 years thinking, okay, the housing market's starting to slow down. So we weren't thinking of a 3% increase. It was more like a 1% increase from that 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. And like I said, we get the numbers from the fall count and the spring count. And we're like, better dig into this further and help explain why and maybe some of the challenges that you may face of, I think, the housing kind of bubble here.
So between using this method one that you're saying, and then obviously working very, very closely with student services, we don't expect, well, anything can happen, but we're trying to tighten up so we're not as off as we were this year.
Yeah, so method two is much more, it's much more conservative, if you will. And for us, I think this 2 years is probably more realistic, looking at all the factors we've seen this year specifically. So again, if you take a look out 5 years on this chart, you're going to be right around 5,000 students at K-12. It's down from 5,300 where you were at in 2010, 11, 12. And again, there's still a lot of for sale homes. I mean, if you just drive around, there's a ton of houses for sale. The problem is the price points pushing those grades 3 through 8 down where they were 5 or 6 years ago.
Paul,
Yes.
if I'm remembering the way you do the model, the projected here, there are no assumptions. I mean, when we do our budgeting forecast, Tina has projections on the economy, on many, many different things. In this model, it's projected, but it's 100%, as far as I remember, it's 100% projected based on historical data.
That's correct. And then
You don't have any guesses. You don't sit there with a dartboard, kind of jokingly, and forecast what things are. What the projected is taking the historical data and moving it forward as the cohorts mature.
Yeah, so again,
So that what you're doing is so that the Model 1, Model 2, I mean, you're not changing your forecasting process because you don't have any forecast in there, it's just projected. What you're doing, though, is you're shortening the instead of 6-year lag, you do a 2-year lag such that the projected react a lot faster to the historical data.
that's a correct statement.
Okay.
So again, we do adjust it community demographics, but again, it's based on actual numbers.
It's all based on actuals and so instead of, it says historical and projected. It doesn't say forecasted. There is no forecast in your number. It's all just taking the actual information and projecting it out into the future, but you don't have assumptions in there.
No, so if we pulled up, let's say, method one, you'd see that you'd be right around 5,200 students for the next 5 years, but we know that's not going to be the case based on the last
And
two.
The only reason method one and method two are different is because it's a moving average because
the algorithm.
the moving average is shorter, it is more reactive to what is actually happening.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Well, that gets into a question that I had too, because obviously, there are variables that you input, because otherwise it would be a math equation that any of us could do.
Well, it is a math equation.
Right, but he also lends some expertise from other areas. It's not just simply math, because otherwise we would need an expert.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it is just math.
Well, it's the math, but it's data driven with the demographic piece behind it. So the number of homes, the number
Right,
of
so that's what I was
ages.
gonna ask
Correct.
you. What other than the amount and price of homes do you look at?
So actually, we subscribe to ESRI, which is the Environmental Services Research Institute. It's everything from new job starts, foreclosures, new business moving in. So whenever someone registers their address at the post office, we're buying that information. If they change address, if they file for divorce, if they get married, if they have kids. So I think there's 86 pages of demographic stuff that comes behind this report that we're pulling data from, not looking just straight at the cohort. So, there's other firms. There's Stanford, Middle Cities, and others that provide enrollment projections, through the Department of Treasury. We've just found that when you take a look at the demographic piece and do some of those adjustments, but it is based on mathematics of, it's not just a live cohort, but again, it's the housing stock, and it's the age of the households and who's choosing private versus public. And like I said, we're just as shocked as I think, the district when we're like, oh my gosh, why are we down 100 some odd kids? And you look at that first column, you're like, boy, what happened from 3rd grade through 8th grade? And for the first time in 6 years, it's less than 100%. So then you start digging, like, people are still choosing Bloomfield schools. They're just not able to move into the district at the pace that they were for the last 4 or 5 years.
Was it people moving out? Was it students that were in these grades that left and went to whether it's private or somewhere else?
No, actually, and that's why I give Ms. Dookie a lot of credit. I mean, we went like building by building, grade by grade, and back for the last 5 years and said, here's where the growth has been from people moving into that particular boundary of that school. And so if you take out the housing piece and you say, okay, what's just the straight cohort, that's why we chose the method too. So again, if I pick on an East Hills or Eastover and you look at the percentage of increase, so not only just by grade, but by individual school, they didn't leave the district, they just simply weren't able to move into that particular boundary for the district itself.
Okay, so you think based on your research that it's not a lot of families leaving out the district that's caused the number to go down?
No, like I said, if you take a look back to just the total number of students, this right here, so it's the same number that you had 3 or 4 years ago. It's just, it's not growing back up where it was that 3rd through 8th grade that you've been experiencing for the last 4 or 5 years. And remember 4 years ago, we were like, a lot of people moved in the district. Next year, not as many. And then 2 years ago, it was kind of like right at it. And then this year is down. And so it's tough because when you do it by year to year, again, 1 or 2%, it's 100 kids swing. That's why I want to give some of the board members who've been here since 2011, 12, we're trying to look over a 5-year period. And it's tough because what is the state going to give you for foundation allowance next year? How many students are we going to have? You're trying to budget June 30. And so I commend the board. I mean, these are, our other 60 clients are dealing with the same issues of like, where's our enrollment going to be? And so again, this is trying to give you a trend model or at least a data point that you can say, hey, if this happens, then this happens. And again, I know the district's got a policy for fund balance, and I applaud the board for that. And again, it's something that helps kind of through these different aspects of enrollment. So.
Just to clarify the point you were making, Paul, so as far as the data is telling you, we don't have an accelerated rate of loss to private schools in the past up to 5 years.
No, actually, so 3 years ago, you actually captured back 1 point, and you've been holding steady at that 23.15%. So.
Thank you.
So what these numbers are saying, though, is over the next 4 or 5 years, we're expecting to have a 200 student decline.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.